The street dog barked at the trash can for hours. What was inside shocked everyone. Mrs. Margaret looked out the window of her small third-floor apartment, watching the street below with tired eyes. The same brown mutt had been barking insistently at the corner trash can for at least 2 hours without pause, while hurried pedestrians simply stepped around it in annoyance. It was when she saw the young man from the bakery throw water at the animal that it backed away for a moment, only to return and bark with even more determination. That stirred something in Margaret, a curiosity she hadn't felt in years, not since becoming a widow and moving to this Chicago neighborhood after selling the house where she'd lived for 4 decades in rural Wisconsin. That dog is trying to tell us something, she murmured to herself, adjusting the shawl over her shoulders. At 72, Margaret Wilson rarely left home unless necessary. Her teacher's retirement pension barely covered her medications, and the grief she carried since losing her husband kept her confined to the same 4 walls day after day. The light rain didn't deter her. She grabbed the umbrella she hadn't used in ages, slipped on her rubber slippers, and left the apartment, slowly descending the stairs while gripping the handrail tightly. Her knees protested with every step, but curiosity was stronger. When she reached the street, she approached cautiously. The dog, seeing her, stopped barking for a moment, watching her with sharp, alert eyes. "Easy there, friend. What are you so desperate to show?" she asked softly, extending her hand for the dog to sniff. To her surprise, the brown mutt wagged its tail and turned back to the trash can, scratching at its metal base with its paws. Mrs. Margaret glanced around, embarrassed to be standing on the sidewalk talking to a dog, but the street was nearly empty on that rainy June evening. Adjusting her glasses, she mustered her courage and lifted the trash can lid, recoiling from the strong smell that escaped. The dog stood on its hind legs, trying to peer inside. Grimacing, Margaret used the tip of her umbrella to push aside some garbage bags. That's when she heard it. A faint sound, almost drowned out by the rain. A whimper. She pushed aside more wet newspapers and discarded wrappers, and her heart raced when she spotted a partially closed shoebox. Inside, wrapped in a dirty cloth, was a newborn baby. Eyes closed, skin tinged purple from the cold. "Dear God," she gasped, dropping her umbrella on the sidewalk. With trembling hands, Margaret lifted the baby, who felt so fragile and light. The child barely moved but was still breathing. The dog barked again as if approving her actions. "I'll get you somewhere safe, little one," she whispered, cradling the baby against her chest, feeling its tiny heartbeat against hers. The rain grew heavier, soaking her grey hair. Margaret looked at the dog, who watched her intently. "You're coming too. You're the one who saved him." The animal, as if understanding every word, followed her back to the building. And so began the story that would forever change the lives of Mrs. Margaret, the mutt she would later name Brave, and the baby someone had thrown away like trash, but whom fate had decided to give a second chance. Inside her modest apartment, Margaret worked quickly. She wrapped the baby in her softest blanket, turned on the heater and checked for any injuries. It was a boy, likely only a few days old. He was freezing, but breathing. "I need to call an ambulance. I need to tell." "The police," she muttered to herself, searching for the phone with shaky hands. The dog entered the apartment and settled near the couch where she'd placed the baby, as if standing guard. Margaret paused for a moment, looking at the two of them. That's when someone knocked on the door. It was Nancy, the neighbor from apartment 302, a retired nurse who always greeted her in the hallway. "Mrs. Margaret, I heard the dog barking. Is everything okay?" she asked before widening her eyes at the scene. "Oh my God, is that a baby?" "I found him in the trash can on the corner," Margaret explained, her voice trembling. "The dog kept barking there for hours, drawing attention. He was almost—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Nancy understood. The nurse quickly stepped closer, her years of experience kicking in. "We need to warm him up slowly. We have to call the hospital, but first—" She assessed the baby with a professional eye. "He needs nutrients. Do you have milk at home?" "Just the powdered kind for my coffee," Margaret replied, feeling helpless. "I'll get what we need from my apartment. Stay with him and keep him warm, but don't overdo it. It was terrible luck, or maybe fate, that you heard this dog." When Nancy left, Margaret sat beside the baby, gently touching his head with its sparse dark hair. How could anyone do this to such a helpless creature? She had always wanted children, but her Joseph had issues and they never could. Now at 72, a baby had entered her life in the most unexpected way. "You're the one who found him," she said to the dog, who seemed unable to take his eyes off the tiny bundle. "You're a hero, you know." The mutt tilted his head as if understanding and moved closer, lying down at the foot of the sofa. Nancy returned minutes later with a bag full of supplies. She prepared an improvised baby bottle with diluted milk, and with the skill of someone who had done it hundreds of times in her career, began feeding the baby, who sucked weakly. "We need to call Child Protective Services and the police," Nancy said as she fed the child. "But first, let's stabilize him a bit. He's dehydrated. He was probably out there for hours." Margaret nodded, but something inside her was already growing attached to this little being fate had placed in her path. A pang struck her chest at the thought that he would soon be taken away. "I'll call right now," she said, standing to grab the landline phone she kept on the side table next to her armchair. It was one of the few luxuries she allowed herself, aside from her old tube TV. As she dialed, she glanced out the window. The rain was falling harder now, and she thought about what might have happened to that child if the dog hadn't been so persistent. A shiver ran down her spine. The mutt lifted his head and looked at her as if guessing her thoughts. In that moment, between the baby's weak cries and the dog's watchful gaze, Margaret knew her life would never be the same. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. It didn't take long for Mrs. Margaret's small apartment to fill with people. A police car, a social worker, and soon an ambulance arrived. The baby was examined right there by a doctor, who declared to everyone's relief that despite his hypothermia and dehydration, he wasn't in critical condition. "He needs to be observed at the hospital," explained the doctor, a young man with glasses who treated Margaret kindly. "But considering the circumstances, he's surprisingly okay." The social worker, a middle-aged woman named Brenda, asked questions and jotted everything down on a clipboard, while an officer inspected the trash can for clues about who might have abandoned the child. "Did you find any identification with the baby? A note? Any documents?" Brenda asked. Margaret shook her head. "Nothing. He was just in the shoebox with this little cloth." The mutt watched everything from the corner of the room, alert but keeping his distance from the strangers. One of the officers tried to approach him, but the dog backed away, wary. "What about this dog? Is he yours?" asked the younger officer. "No, I mean he was the one who found the baby. He kept barking at the trash can until someone paid attention." The social worker jotted something down on her clipboard and furrowed her brows. "Unfortunately, the baby will have to go to a shelter temporarily until we locate relatives or other arrangements are made," she said in a professional tone. That couldn't completely hide her compassion. Margaret felt a pang in her chest. Even though she had only known that child for a few hours, she already felt an inexplicable connection. "What if—" She hesitated, unsure if she should voice her thoughts. "What if I wanted to keep him temporarily?" Brenda looked at her in surprise. "Mrs. Wilson, there are procedures. You live alone and you're— Forgive me for asking, but how old are you?" 72, Margaret answered, straightening her shoulders as if bracing for battle. "I understand. Your good intentions, but caring for a newborn is demanding. There are legal matters involved, temporary custody processes, evaluations." Brenda explained gently but firmly. Margaret nodded, knowing it was a foolish thought. What could she, an elderly widow with few resources, possibly offer a baby? Nancy, who had stayed by her side the whole time, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Margaret, you've already done so much by saving this child. Now we need to let the authorities do their job." As the baby was being prepared to leave, the older officer approached. "Will you be keeping the dog?" Margaret looked at the mutt, who was still watching everything with his attentive eyes. She had never had a pet. Joseph was allergic, and after he passed, she never considered it. "Does the building allow it?" Nancy asked. Yes, they do, Margaret replied, but I don't know if... She glanced at the dog again. He had saved a life. How could she leave him on the streets now? I'll keep him, she finally declared. He deserves a home. The officer nodded approvingly. You'll need to come to the police station tomorrow to sign your statement. We'll investigate who abandoned this child. When everyone finally left, taking the baby with them, Margaret felt an overwhelming emptiness. The apartment, which just hours ago had seemed the same as always, now felt different. The dogs, wet paw prints on the floor, the smell of milk, the disheveled blanket on the sofa. Everything reminded her of what had happened. The mutt approached her and for the first time nudged his nose against her hand as if asking permission to stay. Do you have a name? She asked, stroking his head. He had no collar or identification. I'll call you Brave, because that's what you are. Brave wagged his tail slightly. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the baby, whether he was okay, who would care for him at the hospital, if he was crying from hunger or cold. Every hour, she got up to check on Brave, who was settled on a makeshift bed of old towels in the living room. For the first time in a long while, she felt she had a purpose, and she decided that somehow she would stay connected to that baby fate had brought into her path. The next morning, after a restless night, Margaret woke up early and got ready to go to the police station. She put on her best outfit, a skirt and blouse set she saved for special occasions, which had grown fewer in recent years. Brave watched her curiously as she got ready. She still didn't have anything proper to give him, except some leftover milk and bread from her breakfast. You'll have to stay here alone for a little while, she explained to the animal, feeling somewhat silly for talking to him as if he were a person. I promise to bring you something better to eat when I get back. As she left the apartment, she ran into Nancy in the hallway. Good morning, Margaret. How was your night, and the new resident? We're still getting to know each other, she replied with a small smile. I'm heading to the police station to give my statement. Nancy nodded. If you need help with the dog, just let me know. I've always loved animals, but ever since my Rusty passed last year, I haven't had the heart to adopt another. Thank you, Nancy. I'll admit I've never had a pet before. I'm not quite sure what to do. It's like having a child, the former nurse smiled. They need food, fresh water, regular walks, and lots of love. The rest, the two of you will figure out together. At the police station, Margaret was surprised by how many people were interested in the case. There was even a reporter from the local paper who wanted to interview her, but she politely declined. She didn't want attention. She just wanted to know how the baby was doing. The police chief, a middle-aged man named Thomas Mitchell, greeted her in his office. Mrs. Margaret, thank you for coming. You did a great service to the community yesterday. It wasn't me, it was the dog, she answered honestly. I just followed his lead. Even so, most people would have ignored it or called the dog catcher instead of investigating. And the baby? How is he? She asked, unable to hide her concern. He's stable. According to the hospital, he's about a week old, and despite being abandoned, he doesn't have any serious health issues. Margaret felt a wave of relief. Can I visit him? The police chief hesitated. Mrs. Wilson, I understand your concern, but the baby is now under state custody. Visits are restricted. Once he's discharged, he'll be placed in a specialized shelter until his situation is resolved. I understand, Margaret replied, trying to mask her disappointment. And about whoever abandoned him, any leads? We're investigating. Unfortunately, the security cameras in the area don't have a good angle of the trash can, but we won't give up on finding who did this. After signing her statement, Margaret left the police station feeling strangely empty. Instead of going straight home, she stopped by the nearby market to buy food for Brave and a few basic items for herself. At the checkout, she saw the headline in the local paper, Elderly Woman and Stray Dog Save Abandoned Baby. There was even a photo of the trash can wrapped in police tape. Her face flushed with embarrassment at the attention, but at the same time, a small sense of pride swelled inside her. Maybe, just maybe, her life could still have some meaning. When she returned to the building, struggling with her bags, she found a small commotion at the entrance. Several neighbors had gathered, and at the center of it all was the building manager, Mr. Wallace, a strict man who seemed to take the building's rules more seriously than the laws of the country. "Ah, here comes the pet owner," he said when he saw her. "Mrs. Wilson, I must remind you that building regulations require pets to be registered with the management and properly vaccinated." I just got him yesterday, Mr. Wallace." "I haven't had time yet," she explained, feeling cornered under the neighbors' stares, many of whom she barely knew despite living there for 3 years. "Furthermore," the manager continued, ignoring her explanation, "there have been complaints about barking and the dog wandering the hallway alone this morning, causing a disturbance." Margaret felt her face grow hot. Had Brave managed to open the door? She'd been so tired, maybe she hadn't closed it properly. "I'm sorry, it won't happen again." A woman Margaret recognized as living on the second floor stepped forward. "I read in the paper what happened, Mrs. Margaret." "You and this dog are heroes," he said enthusiastically. "Mr. Wallace should be proud to have you living here." Several other neighbors murmured in agreement, and the building manager seemed uncomfortable with the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "Well, rules exist for everyone," he insisted, though with less conviction. "I hope you'll arrange for the dog's vaccines and registration as soon as possible." "Don't worry," Margaret replied, feeling strangely strengthened by the unexpected support. A younger neighbor offered to help her with the bags, and together they went up to her apartment. When she opened the door, they found Brave waiting eagerly, wagging his tail at the sight of her. He had knocked over a few things in the kitchen, probably looking for food, but otherwise he seemed to have behaved reasonably well for a street mutt on his first day indoors. "He's adorable," commented the neighbor Jessica, as she helped Margaret put away the groceries. "You know, I volunteer at an animal shelter on weekends. If you'd like, I can take you both there to get his shots. They usually charge a small fee for rescued animals." Margaret thanked her, surprised by the unexpected kindness. In 3 years of living there, she had rarely exchanged more than greetings with the other residents. "That would be wonderful. I admit I don't know anything about taking care of a dog." "It's all in the instincts, Mrs. Margaret. Look how he already seems to know this is his home now," Jessica replied, watching as Brave circled the apartment, sniffing every corner as if mapping out his territory. After the young woman left, Margaret sat in her armchair, exhausted by the whirlwind of emotions from the last 24 hours. Brave came over and rested his head on her knee, looking up at her with his brown eyes that seemed to understand exactly what she was feeling. "We're both starting something new, aren't we?" she said, stroking the dog's ears. "I hope it works out." Deep down, she wondered if she would ever see the baby they had saved again. An idea was forming in her mind, but she knew it would be difficult, maybe impossible, for a woman her age. Still, for the first time in a long while, she felt she had a purpose worth fighting for. A week passed and Margaret's life settled into a new routine with Brave around. The dog had adapted surprisingly well to apartment living, though he sometimes grew restless, especially when she took too long to take him for walks. Jessica, the neighbor who had offered to help, kept her promise and took them to the animal shelter, where Brave got his necessary shots and a full checkup. The veterinarian estimated he was between 3 and 4 years old, and remarked on how unusual it was for a street mutt to be so sociable and well-adjusted. "He probably had a home before," the vet explained. "Dogs like him are usually abandoned or lost, not born on the streets." That broke Margaret's heart. How could anyone abandon such a loyal companion? The case of the baby found in the trash had gained attention in the local news. Margaret avoided interviews but followed the reports closely, anxious for any updates about the child. According to the papers, the police already had some leads on the mother, a 16-year-old girl who had apparently hidden her pregnancy from her family. One Saturday morning, as she sipped her coffee, Margaret heard a knock at the door. It was Nancy, her nurse neighbor, with a serious expression. "Good morning, Margaret. May I come in? I have news about the baby." Margaret invited her in, her heart racing. Brave approached to sniff the visitor, who absently petted him. "I still volunteer at the hospital sometimes," Nancy explained. "And I found out that the baby you found was discharged, but what?" asked Margaret, worried. "He was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition. It's not serious enough to immediately threaten his life, but he'll need special care and possibly surgery in the future." Margaret sat down, feeling her legs go weak. "And where did they take him?" "To the city shelter, as planned, but Margaret—" Nancy hesitated. Children with special needs have a harder time getting adopted, and shelters aren't equipped to provide the individualized care these babies need. Margaret felt something break inside her. She pictured that helpless child already starting life with so many obstacles, alone in an institutional environment. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked, though she already knew the chances were slim. Nancy took a deep breath. "Actually, I came here because I had an idea. There's a little-known program called Foster Family. Registered families temporarily take in children awaiting judicial decisions, offering a family environment until they can be adopted or returned to their biological families." "And you think I—" Margaret couldn't finish the sentence, her voice choked with emotion. It would be hard. They usually prefer younger families with more resources. "But you saved this child. You have a bond with her, and I could testify on your behalf, help with care when needed. If you want to try, I can put you in touch with a social worker I know." The idea seemed absurd. Margaret, at 72, with limited means, no experience with babies, becoming a temporary guardian for a child. But something inside her said it was the right thing to do. "I want to try," she finally said. "What do I need to do?" Nancy smiled, but her eyes were cautious. "It won't be easy, Margaret. They'll investigate your health, finances, your home, your routine. They'll question whether a woman your age has the energy to care for a newborn, especially one with special needs." "I know it sounds crazy," Margaret admitted, "but I feel I owe it to him and to myself. I spent years hiding in this apartment after Joseph passed. Maybe it's time to do something meaningful again." Brave, as if understanding the gravity of the conversation, came over and rested his head on Margaret's lap. She smiled at the dog. "Besides, now I have a bodyguard." Nancy promised to make the necessary arrangements, and the next day she brought forms for Margaret to fill out. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Social worker visits, interviews, medical exams to prove she was healthy enough to care for a child, apartment modifications. To her surprise, many neighbors offered help when they heard about her plan. Jessica brought some baby clothes her niece no longer used. Mr. Wallace, the building manager who once seemed so strict, offered to install window safety locks for free. Even the owner of the corner bakery, who used to barely greet her, started asking about the progress whenever she went to buy bread. One afternoon, as she cleared space in the bedroom for the crib donated by a fifth-floor neighbor, Margaret heard Brave bark differently. It wasn't an alert or aggressive bark, it sounded almost excited. She went to the living room and found the dog staring intently at the door. Seconds later, the doorbell rang. It was Brenda, the social worker who had been at the apartment the night they found the baby. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wilson. Can we talk?" Margaret invited her in, nervous. Brenda looked around, noticing the changes in the apartment. The outlet covers, the partially assembled crib visible through the bedroom door, the educational toys on the table. "I see you're really determined," she said. "More than ever," Margaret confirmed. Brenda sat on the couch, placing her folder on the coffee table. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Wilson. Your case divided opinions at Child Protective Services. On one hand, your age is a concern, and your financial resources are limited." Margaret felt her heart tighten. "On the other hand," Brenda continued, "you've shown an impressive ability to mobilize the community. Your neighbors sent letters of support. The retired nurse committed to helping with the baby's care, and even the doctor who treated the child at the hospital wrote a recommendation. Not to mention the fact that you were the one who saved this child in the first place." Brave approached Brenda, sniffing her folder with interest. The social worker smiled and patted the dog's head. "And of course, there's this hero here." "So, what does this mean?" Margaret asked, afraid to hope. "It means CPS has decided to grant you temporary custody of the baby, initially for a period of 3 months, with weekly monitoring by a multidisciplinary team. If everything goes well, this period can be extended until the child's permanent situation is resolved." Margaret brought her hands to her mouth, unable to hold back her tears. "Do you want to know his name?" Brenda asked with a gentle smile. "He has a name. The hospital staff called him Ethan, but as his temporary guardian, you'll have the right to choose what to call him." "Ethan is a beautiful name," Margaret replied, smiling through her tears. Ethan and Brave, my new family. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. Ethan's arrival at Margaret's apartment was an event that mobilized the entire building. Neighbors she barely knew showed up with gifts. Diapers, tiny clothes, toys, even a high chair that had been stored in someone's basement for years. The first day was terrifying. Despite all the preparation and Nancy's support, who practically moved onto Margaret's couch in those early days, the reality of caring for a newborn with a heart condition was far more intense than any manual could describe. Ethan needed medication at specific times, frequent feedings and constant attention to signs that his little heart might be under stress. Sometimes his breathing would quicken, or his skin would turn slightly blue, sending Margaret into a panic. Even as Nancy reassured her these were normal fluctuations for his condition. You'll learn to tell the difference between real warning signs and routine moments, the nurse explained patiently. Trust your instincts. What surprised Margaret most was Brave's reaction. The dog, who had already proven his worth by saving Ethan, took on the role of devoted guardian. He slept beside the crib, whimpering softly to alert them when the baby stirred before even crying, and seemed to instinctively understand he needed to be gentle around the child. One night, after 3 exhausting but rewarding weeks, Margaret was rocking Ethan to sleep when she heard a soft knock at the door. Nancy, who was in the kitchen making tea, went to answer. It was Brenda, the social worker, accompanied by a young girl who couldn't have been more than 17. The girl was pale, visibly nervous, and her eyes were swollen from crying. "Good evening, Mrs. Wilson," Brenda greeted her with a solemn expression. "Sorry for coming unannounced, but a situation came up that we need to resolve immediately." Margaret felt a chill in her stomach. She had already grown so attached to Ethan that the thought of losing him filled her with panic. "This is Ashley," Brenda continued, gesturing to the teenager. She's Ethan's birth mother." The shock left Margaret speechless. She held the baby a little tighter against her chest as if she could protect him. Can I see him?" Ashley asked in a voice so quiet it was barely audible. Margaret hesitated, but something in the girl's desperate expression made her relent. She stepped forward slowly, allowing Ashley to see the baby sleeping in her arms. Tears began streaming down the young woman's face. "He looks so different, bigger," she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand but stopping just short of touching her son. I didn't want to leave him there, but my dad said he'd kick me out if I came home with a baby." Brenda intervened. Ashley gathered her courage and told her family everything. The reaction wasn't good at first, but after a lot of talking, her parents decided to support her. She came to claim custody of Ethan. Margaret felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. In just a few weeks, Ethan and Brave had filled the void of years of loneliness. The thought of losing the baby was almost unbearable. But looking at Ashley, so young and clearly remorseful, she couldn't bring herself to feel anger. "I know I don't have the right to ask this," Ashley continued, now looking directly at Margaret, "but I want a chance. Does he have any problems? Did the doctors say anything?" It was Nancy who answered, with her professional nurse's tone. "Ethan has a congenital heart condition that requires special care, regular medication, frequent checkups, possibly surgery in the future." Ashley seemed to crumble a little more. "I didn't know. Is it my fault because I left him in the cold?" "No, sweetheart," Nancy replied gently. "It's a condition he was born with. It has nothing to do with what happened afterward." Brenda cleared her throat. "Mrs. Wilson, legally, as the birth mother whose parental rights were never officially terminated, Ashley has priority in Ethan's custody. However, considering the circumstances and the baby's special condition, Child Protective Services recommended a transition period." "Transition?" Margaret asked, feeling a thread of hope. "Yes, Ashley is still a minor and will need her family's support to raise Ethan. We suggest shared custody for now. Ashley would spend time here, learning about Ethan's specific needs, and gradually, as she demonstrates capability, she'd take on more responsibility." Margaret looked down at the baby in her arms, then at the young mother, and finally at Brave, who was watching the whole scene intently, as if he understood every word. I think we can make this work, she said finally. If it's what's best for Ethan. Ashley lifted her face, surprised. You'd help me? After what I did? Everyone makes mistakes, dear, Margaret replied, surprising even herself, with the strength in her voice. What matters is learning from them and moving forward. Ethan needs both of us now. In the weeks that followed, an unusual arrangement took shape. Ashley came every afternoon after school and on weekends to learn how to care for her son. At first, her fear and uncertainty were obvious, especially when Ethan had episodes where his breathing grew labored. But with Margaret and Nancy's patient guidance, she slowly gained confidence. Ashley's parents, initially resistant, also began to participate. Her mother, Mrs. Donner, a stern but kind-hearted woman, ended up falling for her grandson and started bringing little clothes and small gifts with every visit. The father, Mr. Kevin, took longer to accept the situation, but when he finally met Ethan, something inside him seemed to soften. He looks like my father, he said once, watching the baby sleep. He has the same strong chin. Brave, always. Protective, took time to accept the new visitors. He was especially wary of Kevin, as if sensing the man's initial resistance. But over time, even the dog grew accustomed to the constant presence of Ashley's family. One afternoon, as Margaret and Ashley bathed Ethan together, the young woman asked a question she'd been holding on to for weeks. Mrs. Margaret, did you never have children? The question caught Margaret off guard. She usually avoided talking about this painful subject. No, dear. Joseph and I tried for many years, but it wasn't possible. Is that why you took such good care of Ethan from the start? Because you always wanted a child? Margaret thought for a moment as she gently dried the baby. Perhaps. But I think that's mostly because when we find someone who needs us, something inside just knows what to do. Ashley fell silent, absorbing those words. You know, Margaret continued, when I was younger, just a bit older than you, I used to teach little children. I always loved being surrounded by them, watching them grow and learn. When I found out I couldn't have children, it felt like a part of me died. But life goes on and we find other ways to nurture that love. Do you think I can be a good mother? Ashley asked, with a vulnerability that reminded Margaret just how young she really was. I think you already are, dear. Being a mother isn't about knowing everything from the start. It's about learning every day, putting your child's needs above your own, and never stopping trying to be better. That night, after Ashley had left, Margaret sat in her armchair with Ethan in her lap, while Brave rested at her feet. A sense of peace she hadn't felt in decades washed over her. Her life had changed completely in just a few weeks, full of responsibilities and worries, but also a love she thought she'd never experience again. The future was still uncertain. In a few months, Ashley would likely take Ethan to live with her and her parents. The thought of parting with the baby still hurt, but Margaret was beginning to accept that her role in his life would be different than she'd first imagined. She would be the grandmother he'd never otherwise have, the person who'd always be there to help and love him unconditionally. And, of course, there would always be Brave, the unlikely hero who'd brought them all together. The months passed, and the routine established between Margaret and Ashley's family worked surprisingly well. Ethan, now 6 months old, was her cheerful and active baby, despite his heart condition requiring constant care. Margaret's apartment had become a second home for Ashley, who often stayed over during the week to avoid disrupting her son's care. Then, on a fall afternoon, after a follow-up doctor's appointment, the news they'd all feared finally arrived. Ethan would need surgery. His condition had worsened, and the doctors recommended the procedure before he turned one. It's a delicate but necessary procedure, explained the pediatric cardiologist, Dr. Michael. The good news is, if successful, it could significantly correct the problem and allow him to live a practically normal life. Margaret and Ashley left the office in silence, each absorbing the news in her own way. Ethan slept peacefully in Ashley's arms, oblivious to the worries his condition caused. How are we going to pay for this? Ashley finally asked as they boarded the bus back home. Despite the public healthcare system, the specialized surgery Ethan needed had a long waiting list, and the doctor had mentioned that, ideally, the procedure should be done within the next 2 months. Margaret squeezed the young woman's hand. "We'll figure it out, my dear. One thing at a time." That night, after Ashley went to her parents' house to share the news, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Nancy and Jessica, the neighbor who worked at the animal shelter and had, over the months, become a close friend. "I sold some jewelry I had kept from my mother," Margaret said, placing an envelope on the table. "It's enough to cover some of the pre-op tests, but it's nowhere near the cost of the surgery." "I have some savings," Nancy offered. "It's not much, but it might help." Jessica thought for a moment. "What if we started a campaign? Your story has already touched so many people. The dog who found the baby in the trash can, the woman who took him in, the young mother who came back full of regret. If we explain that he now needs surgery, I'm sure many people would help." The idea seemed good, but Margaret hesitated. "I don't want to expose Ethan and Ashley too much. They've already been through so much." "We can do it discreetly," Jessica insisted. "No photos of them, just telling the story and explaining the need. I can ask a friend who works in social media for help." After much discussion, they decided to go ahead with the campaign idea. Jessica and her friend created an online page sharing Ethan's, Margaret's, and Brave's story, focusing on the urgent need for surgery. They only included a photo of Brave looking at a crib, protecting the child's identity. The response was beyond anything they could have imagined. Within days, the story had spread across the internet, touching hearts all over the country. Donations began pouring in, first small amounts, then larger sums. A local TV station reached out, wanting to do a feature. After much hesitation, Margaret agreed to an interview, as long as Ethan's face wasn't shown and Ashley could decide whether or not to participate. To everyone's surprise, Ashley chose to speak. With a maturity that tugged at the heartstrings, of all who knew her, she sat before the cameras and told her story. The fear she felt upon discovering her pregnancy, her family's pressure, the desperate decision she made, and how deeply she regretted it afterward. "I made the worst mistake of my life that day," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But thanks to an incredible woman and a heroic dog, my son got a second chance. Now he needs another one, and we're asking for help." The segment aired during prime time, and by the next day, the campaign had raised more than double the amount needed for the surgery. Calls came in from hospitals offering to perform the procedure, from specialists volunteering their services, and even from families who had gone through similar situations offering support. A week later, Ethan was admitted to one of the best pediatric hospitals in the city, with all expenses covered by the donations. The surgery, which lasted nearly 8 hours, was a success. The baby's heart, now corrected, beat stronger and more steadily. During the recovery, which would take weeks, a new challenge arose. Ashley's parents announced they had decided to move to another city, where Kevin had received a better job offer. Naturally, they expected Ashley and Ethan to go with them. The news hit Margaret like a bombshell. The thought of losing daily contact with Ethan, especially after the surgery they had faced together, was devastating. But she knew she had no right to interfere with the family's decisions. One afternoon, while Ethan slept in the hospital under Donna's care, Ashley asked to speak privately with Margaret in the hospital cafe. "Mrs. Margaret, I don't know what to do," confessed the young woman, nervously twisting her cup between her hands. "My parents want me to go with them, and it makes sense. There, I'll have more support raising Ethan. I can finish my studies while they help with him." "It's a good opportunity, dear," Margaret replied, swallowing the lump in her throat. "You should think about what's best for Ethan." "But what about you and Brave? You've saved his life twice now. Ethan loves you, and so do I." Margaret felt the tears she'd been holding back for days finally escape. "We love you too, my dear, but sometimes loving someone means letting them go. You can come visit us, and who knows, when I'm up to it, maybe I can come see you too." Ashley shook her head, her young face showing surprising determination. "I've been thinking, what if I didn't go? What if I stayed here?" "What do you mean?" "My parents won't move for another 3 months. By then, Ethan will have recovered from his surgery. I thought maybe I could stay. Rent a small place near you, get a part-time job, finish my studies at night. Ashley, that would be so hard for you. I know, but it would be even harder to take Ethan away from you and Brave. And honestly, Mrs. Margaret, I don't know if I could do it. You've become like a mother to me these past few months. The words touched Margaret's heart deeply. In her life, she'd never imagined that at 72, she'd be called mother by a young woman who could have been her granddaughter. If this is what you want, we'll find a way, she finally said. My apartment has 2 bedrooms. You and Ethan can stay with me until you get settled. Ashley smiled through her tears. You'd do that for us? My dear, after everything we've been through together, we're family. And family sticks together no matter what. When Ethan was discharged from the hospital, it was to Margaret's apartment that they all went. Ashley's parents, though sad about their daughter's decision to stay, promised to help financially and visit often. The room that had once been only Margaret's was rearranged to accommodate Ashley too, and the small office was permanently converted into Ethan's room. The apartment, which for years had been a place of loneliness, now overflowed with life. Brave, as always, adapted perfectly to the new arrangement. He slept at the foot of Ethan's bed every night, like an eternal guardian. And during the day he followed the baby, who was now starting to crawl, always alert and protective. One morning over coffee, Ashley made an announcement. I got a part-time job at a bookstore near the school. The owner is really understanding and said, I can bring Ethan with me sometimes if needed. That's wonderful, dear, Margaret exclaimed, genuinely happy for the young woman's achievement. And there's one more thing, Ashley continued, her eyes shining. I've decided what I want to study after high school. What is it? I want to be a social worker, like Brenda. I want to help other girls going through what I went through, show them there's always a way out better than despair. Margaret's chest swelled with pride. You'll be an excellent social worker, my dear. You have a huge heart, and you've already learned lessons some people take a lifetime to understand. That afternoon, as she watched Ashley playing on the rug with Ethan, who now giggled while trying to reach Brave, Margaret felt a certainty she hadn't known in a long time. Everything had happened exactly as it should. The dog who had barked tirelessly at a trash can on a rainy afternoon hadn't just saved a baby. He had created a family where before there had only been lonely, lost souls. And for Margaret, who thought she had already experienced everything life could offer, it was as if a new journey was just beginning. A journey made of small moments, Ethan's first words, Ashley's daily achievements and Brave's watchful eyes, always keeping an eye on all of them, just as he had since that first day by the trash can. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Ethan's first birthday was celebrated with a small party in Margaret's apartment. Though the space was limited, it seemed like the whole building wanted to join in. Mr. Wallace, the once strict building manager, arrived early to help with decorations. Jessica brought a cake shaped like a dog in honor of Brave. Nancy coordinated everything with the efficiency of a head nurse. Ashley's parents, who now lived 2 hours away, came for the weekend. They brought gifts and the news that they were renovating a room in their new home for when Ethan and Ashley visited. He's so strong and healthy, Donna remarked, watching her grandson take his first steps while holding onto the furniture. Who would have thought after everything? Kevin, who had initially been the most resistant to the whole situation, was now a doting grandfather, always with his phone in hand to capture every new milestone. Ashley told us you're looking for a bigger apartment, he said to Margaret, as they watched the children play. Yes, this one's getting too small for the 4 of us, she replied, including Brave in the count, as she always did. With Ethan growing up, he'll need more space, and Ashley deserves her own room. Kevin hesitated, exchanging a glance with his wife. We'd like to help. It's not much, but we have some savings. We see it as an investment in our grandson's future. Margaret was touched by the offer. Over the past few months, her relationship with Ashley's parents had evolved from mutual distrust to genuine respect. That's very generous, but I can't accept. You already help so much with the monthly expenses. Please, Mrs. Margaret, Donna interjected. Without you, we might not even have our grandson today. Let us repay a little of what you've done for our family. Before Margaret could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion. Ethan, leaning on Brave, had taken his first steps completely on his own, crossing nearly half a yard before plopping down with a giggle. Ashley, who was filming everything, had tears in her eyes. Did you see that? His first steps. And look how Brave stays still so he can lean on him. The dog, now estimated by the vet to be about 5 years old, remained perfectly still, letting Ethan use his body for support. From the beginning, he'd seemed to instinctively understand what the baby needed. The party stayed lively until early evening when guests began to leave. Ashley's parents were the last to go, promising to return the following month. After Ethan was put to bed, Ashley, Margaret, and Brave sat in the living room, exhausted but happy. It was a perfect day, said Ashley, now a young woman of nearly 18, so different from the frightened teenager Margaret had first met. I can't believe it's already been a year. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday Brave was barking at that trash can, Margaret agreed. And other times it's like you've always been part of my life. Brave, hearing his name, lifted his head from the rug where he rested. He was aging well, but a few white hairs were starting to appear on his muzzle. About what my dad said earlier, Ashley began cautiously. I think we should accept their help for the new apartment. Margaret sighed. I don't feel comfortable, dear. We've already received so much help from so many people. And we've helped many people too, Ashley reminded her. The campaign for Ethan raised more than we needed, and we donated the rest to other children with heart conditions. You give free tutoring to kids in the neighborhood. I volunteer on Saturdays. Even Brave visits that nursing home once a month as a therapy dog. Margaret smiled, remembering how Brave behaved impeccably during the nursing home visits, letting elderly residents pet him, many of whom rarely had other visitors. You're right, maybe I'm being proud. It's not pride, Ashley replied gently. You've always been independent, and that's admirable. But that's what family is, isn't it? Helping each other when we can. The young woman's words touched Margaret deeply. Family. For so long it had been just her and memories of Joseph. Now it was this unlikely constellation of people and a dog brought together by an extraordinary event. Let's think about it, she finally agreed. Now you should get some sleep. You have class early tomorrow. Ashley had resumed her studies with determination after Ethan's birth. With Margaret's help and neighbors taking turns caring for the baby, she managed to keep her grades up while working part-time at the bookstore. When Margaret was alone in the living room, with only Brave for company, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Throughout her life, she had faced many losses: the inability to have children, Joseph's prolonged illness, his death, the forced sale of the house where they'd lived for so many years. For a while, she believed her story was essentially over, that she was just waiting for her days to end, in the loneliness of an apartment too small for her memories. But life had other plans. Life had Brave, Ethan, and Ashley. The move to The new apartment happened when Ethan was 1.5 years old. It was more spacious, just 2 blocks from the old one, with 3 bedrooms, a small balcony, and, most importantly for Margaret, a playground in the square across the street. Trips to the playground became an essential part of their routine. Ethan, now fully recovered from heart surgery, was an active and curious child, always trying to run faster than his little legs could manage. Brave followed him patiently, sometimes walking ahead when other dogs were nearby, as if assessing whether they were safe for his charge. It was on one of these mornings at the playground that Margaret noticed a man watching them from a nearby bench. He looked about 40, dressed simply but neatly, and something about the way he stared at Brave made her uneasy. When the man finally approached, her first instinct was to call Ethan closer. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Sorry to bother you, but that dog looks a lot like one I had a few years ago." Brave, usually protective, showed no hostility toward the stranger. Instead, he seemed curious, sniffing the air in his direction. "We found him on the street almost 2 years ago," Margaret explained, cautiously. "Actually, he was the one who found My grandson. She had grown used to introducing Ethan as her grandson to simplify explanations in casual situations. "May I?" the man asked, gesturing that he wanted to approach the dog. Hesitantly, Margaret nodded. The man knelt and reached out to Brave, who sniffed his fingers and, to her surprise, began wagging his tail vigorously. "Buddy, is that you, boy?" The man's voice choked with emotion. "Buddy?" Margaret repeated, confused. That was his name. My dog disappeared almost 4 years ago during a storm. I searched for months, put up posters, ads in the paper, but I never found him. Ethan, intrigued by the conversation, approached and hugged Brave around the neck, as he always did when he needed protection or comfort. "How can I be sure it's the same dog?" asked Margaret, feeling a tightness in her chest. Brave was an essential part of her family. The man smiled sadly. "He has a small scar under his right ear from when he was a puppy and cut himself on a fence. And if you call his name—" Before he could finish the sentence, Brave had already turned to him, ears perked up. "Buddy, sit," the man commanded softly. To Margaret's dismay, the dog obeyed immediately, something he rarely did when she gave the command. "My name is Robert," the man introduced himself, extending his hand. "I'm a science teacher at the public school nearby. I moved to this neighborhood recently." Margaret, still dazed, introduced herself and briefly explained how Brave, or Buddy, had come into her life, saving Ethan from certain death in the trash can. "He's always been special," Robert remarked with evident pride. "Even as a puppy, he showed unusual intelligence. I'm not surprised he did something like that." For a few uncomfortable minutes, they stood there, both clearly thinking about what would happen next. Margaret couldn't deny that the dog recognized the man, but the thought of losing Brave was unbearable. "Look, I understand how much he means to you," Robert finally said, seeming to read her thoughts. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. In fact, I'd already accepted I'd never see him again. Finding him here, it felt like a miracle." Ethan, oblivious to the tension between the adults, played with Brave, tossing a small ball that the dog patiently retrieved, always returning to drop it at the boy's feet. "He really loves your grandson," Robert observed. "Actually." Margaret hesitated, but something in the man's sincerity made her trust him. "Ethan isn't my biological grandson. The story is complicated, but let's just say Brave Buddy brought us together in a way that changed our lives forever." Over the next few minutes, Margaret shared a condensed version of the extraordinary events that had formed their unconventional family. Robert listened intently, occasionally glancing at the dog with an expression mixing pride and nostalgia. "That explains why I never found him," he said when she finished. "You were on the other side of town." A heavy silence fell between them. Finally, Margaret gathered the courage to ask, "Are you going to take him back?" Robert watched Ethan and Brave playing, then looked at Margaret, seeing the worry on her face. "He has a home, a family who loves him, and clearly he cares deeply about you." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "It would be selfish of me to separate you now." Margaret felt a wave of relief, but also a pang of sympathy for the man. Maybe you could visit him sometimes," she offered. "I'm sure he'd be happy to see his first owner." Robert's face brightened. "That would be wonderful. And perhaps I could bring my daughter too?" She was only 5 when Buddy disappeared and was devastated. Knowing he's safe and happy would mean so much to her. In the months that followed, a new routine took shape. Robert visited on Sundays, sometimes accompanied by his daughter Sophie, now 9. Brave, who responded to both his new and old name, always showed great excitement during these visits. To Margaret's surprise, Robert fit naturally into the constellation of people orbiting her small family. As a teacher, he offered to help Ashley with her college entrance exam prep, and his science knowledge made explanations about Ethan's heart condition much clearer. One afternoon, while Robert was teaching Ethan how to feed the ducks by the lake in the park, with Brave keeping watch nearby, Ashley said to Margaret, "It's funny how things happen, isn't it? I've always heard there's no such thing as coincidences." "What do you mean?" "Think about it. Brave ran away from Robert during a storm, ended up on the other side of town, saw me putting Ethan in that..." She still struggled to say the word trash can in that place, and then barked until you found him. Years later, they meet again by chance. How could that just be a coincidence? Margaret smiled, watching the group by the lake. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's exactly how it was meant to be. That night, after everyone had left, Margaret sat on the balcony of her new apartment, with Brave lying at her feet. The dog wasn't so young anymore. The vet estimated he was about 6. But he still had the same energy and intelligence that had driven him to bark tirelessly at a trash can on a rainy afternoon. "You really are special, you know," she said, stroking his soft ears. "No matter what name you go by, you've changed so many lives." Brave looked up at her with that expression that seemed to understand every word. From inside the apartment came Ashley's voice, singing a lullaby to Ethan. Soon she would start college, fulfilling her dream of becoming a social worker. Ethan was growing up strong and healthy, adored by everyone around him. And Margaret, who once thought her life was ending, discovered it was actually just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with love, challenges, and joys she had never imagined experiencing. All because a stray dog decided to bark at a trash can until someone paid attention. 3 years had passed since that fateful day when Brave wouldn't stop barking at the trash can. Ethan was now 4, a vibrant little boy full of energy, completely recovered from the heart surgery that had saved his life as a baby. His condition still required regular checkups, but the doctors were optimistic he could live a practically normal life. Ashley, now 20, was in her 2nd year of college for social work, balancing studies with her job at the bookstore and motherhood. She had blossomed from a frightened teenager into a determined young woman, eager to use her own experiences to help others. One Saturday morning, as everyone was having coffee in the sunny kitchen of the apartment, the phone rang. It was Brenda, the social worker who had followed their case from the beginning. "Mrs. Margaret," her voice sounded tense. "I need to talk to you all. A delicate situation has come up. Can I stop by today?" Margaret felt a chill in her stomach. After all this time, what could be so urgent? Brenda arrived in the early afternoon, looking uncomfortable, uncharacteristic for her usual professional demeanor. After politely declining the coffee, Margaret offered she got straight to the point. "We've received a formal request at Child Protective Services. Ethan's biological father is claiming his paternal rights." The news hit like a bomb. Ashley visibly paled. "What do you mean? What father?" Margaret asked, instinctively moving closer to the young woman to offer support. Apparently, the young man only recently found out about Ethan's existence. "His name is Matthew Johnson. He's 21, and according to him, he didn't know about the pregnancy until he saw an old news report about the campaign for Ethan's surgery. He recognized Ashley and put the pieces together." Ashley seemed to struggle to breathe. He said he didn't want anything to do with it when I told him," she murmured almost to herself. "Ashley, did you know who the father was?" Margaret asked gently. "Yes, but we were only together once. When I found out I was pregnant and told him, Matthew said he didn't want the responsibility, that I was lying, that it could be anyone's." Tears streamed down her face. "After that, he blocked my number, avoided me at school. By the time my parents found out, it was too late to look for him." Brenda nodded, jotting down the information. "This complicates the legal situation. If you informed him about the pregnancy and he chose not to be involved, that could work in your favor. But he's claiming he didn't believe you were really pregnant, and that seeing the news report he realized his mistake. And now? What happens?" asked Margaret, her heart tightening at the thought of Ethan being taken away. "He's requesting paternity recognition with a DNA test and visitation rights. Depending on the results and the judge's evaluation, he could ask for shared custody." Ashley covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "He can't just show up after 4 years and pretend he cares. Ethan doesn't even know who he is." Brave, sensing her distress, moved closer and rested his head on Ashley's lap, looking up at her with attentive, worried eyes. The simple gesture seemed to calm her slightly. "Legally, if he's confirmed as the biological father, he has rights," Brenda explained. "But Ethan's well-being will always be the court's priority. Your history, the stability you've provided for him, all of that will be taken into account. The days that followed were tense. Ethan, thankfully unaware of the unfolding drama, continued his normal routine of playing, preschool, and walks with Brave. But for the adults, especially Ashley and Margaret, every moment was filled with anxiety. A week later, the inevitable meeting arrived. Matthew had requested a session mediated by Child Protective Services before pursuing legal action. Reluctantly, Ashley agreed, hoping to resolve things with as little trauma as possible. Margaret insisted on going with her, and together they went to the CPS building, leaving Ethan in Nancy's care. Matthew was already there when they arrived, sitting nervously in a chair in the meeting room. He was a tall young man with an ordinary appearance, dressed formally as if trying to make an impression. When he saw Ashley, he stood quickly. "Ash," he began, using a nickname that clearly hinted at past intimacy. "It's Ashley," she corrected, coldly. "This is Mrs. Margaret, my family." The meeting was tense from the start. Matthew explained that he had moved to another city right after the incident with Ashley, that he truly hadn't believed she was pregnant at the time, and that only recently, when visiting relatives, had he learned the story from an aunt who recognized Ashley in an old news report. "I've grown up," he insisted. "I have a stable job now. I'm finishing college. I want to meet my son, be part of his life." "You had your chance 4 years ago," Ashley replied with a sharpness that even surprised Margaret. "You chose not to believe me, to abandon me when I needed you most. Do you know what happened after that? Do you know where your son almost ended up because you left?" Brenda stepped in before things escalated. "We're here to find a path that benefits Ethan above all else. Blaming each other for the past won't help us do that." After hours of difficult discussion, they reached a preliminary agreement. Matthew would take the DNA test, and if paternity was confirmed, he would start with supervised visits, gradually progressing as Ethan adjusted to his presence. On the way home, Ashley stayed silent. Only when they were nearly at the building did she suddenly stop on the sidewalk. "Mrs. Margaret, what if he tries to take Ethan from me? What if the judge thinks he can offer more than I can?" Margaret took the young woman's hands in hers. "That won't happen. You're a wonderful mother. Ethan has a stable, happy life surrounded by love. No judge would take that away from him. But Matthew has a better job. He's almost graduated. He can probably provide things I can't." "Money isn't everything, my dear. You gave Ethan the most important thing, unconditional love, even in the hardest moments. You were the one who stayed up nights when he was sick. You celebrated every little achievement. Those bonds don't break easily." When they got home, they found Ethan asleep on the couch, hugging Brave, who kept his usual watch. The scene, so peaceful in contrast to the emotional turmoil of the day, brought tears to both their eyes. "See," whispered Margaret, "this is what matters. This home we've built together." In the following weeks, the DNA test confirmed it. Matthew was undoubtedly Ethan's biological father. Supervised visits began first in the neutral setting of Child Protective Services, with Ashley present. Ethan, naturally curious, accepted the simplified explanation that Matthew was a special friend who wanted to get to know him. The boy, sociable by nature, didn't resist, but also didn't show immediate attachment. It was during the fourth visit that the first unexpected moment happened. Matthew brought Ethan a gift, a stuffed dog that vaguely resembled Brave. "Look, it's like your dog," he said excitedly. "When you come visit me at my house, we can get a real dog too. What do you think?" Ethan frowned, confused. "But I already have Brave, and I live with Mommy and Grandma Margaret." "Yes, but sometimes you can stay with me too. I have a whole room just for you at my place." The comment, seemingly innocent, triggered an immediate reaction in Ethan. He ran into Ashley's arms, suddenly unsure. "I don't want to go. I want to stay with Mommy and Brave." Matthew looked frustrated but tried to backtrack. "It doesn't have to be now, but one day, when we know each other better." The social worker supervising the visit stepped in, suggesting a break. By the end, it was clear to everyone that mentioning separating Ethan from his family had been a serious misstep. That night at home, Ethan was restless, asking Ashley repeatedly if he'd have to go live with the new man. "No, sweetheart," she assured him, holding him tight. "You'll stay with Mommy, Grandma Margaret, and Brave, just like always." But the seed of insecurity had been planted. Ethan, who had always been a cheerful, confident child, began showing signs of anxiety. He didn't want to go to school, cried when Ashley left for work, and started having nightmares. Brave, always attuned to his little protector's emotions, became even more watchful. During the nightmares, he was usually the first to wake, fetching Ashley or Margaret before Ethan's cries grew loud. The situation worried both Ashley and Margaret. After consulting a child psychologist, they decided to be more transparent with Ethan, explaining in terms he could understand. Matthew was his biological father, like his classmates' dads, but he'd been away a long time and now wanted to know him better. "Does that mean he's my dad like Annie's dad is hers?" Ethan asked, trying to grasp it. "In a way, yes," Ashley answered carefully, "but families can be different. Some kids have a mom and dad who live together. Others have parents in separate homes. Some have two moms or two dads. And some, like you, have a mom, a grandma, and a dad who's just starting to know you." Ethan thought for a moment. "What about Brave? Is he family too?" Ashley smiled. "Of course he is. A very important family who found you first." This explanation seemed to satisfy Ethan, who gradually grew accustomed to Matthew's visits, especially after they began happening in the apartment with Brave present. The dog, initially wary of the stranger, slowly accepted his presence, though he always kept a watchful eye on Ethan. Surprisingly, it was Robert, Brave's former owner, who offered a perspective that helped ease the tension. During one of his regular Sunday visits, while Ethan played with Sophie in the park, Robert remarked to Margaret and Ashley, "You know, when I found Brave, or Buddy as I used to call him, after all that time, my first instinct was to take him home with me. After all, he was my dog first. I raised him from a puppy." Ashley looked at him, surprised by his candor. "But then I realized," Robert continued, "that what mattered most wasn't who he legally belonged to, but where he was loved and happy. And clearly he had found a home with you, a place where he wasn't just loved, but also needed." He paused, watching Ethan and the dog play. "Maybe your Matthew needs to understand that too. It's not about legal or biological rights. It's about Ethan's well-being." Robert's words deeply moved Ashley. The next time Matthew visited, she asked for a moment alone with him before Ethan joined them. "I know you want to be part of Ethan's life, and I respect that," she said, with a calm that surprised even herself. "But I need you to understand one thing. His well-being comes first. This isn't about me, you, or our rights. It's about him, his happiness and safety." Matthew, who in recent weeks had begun to grasp the impact of his sudden appearance in his son's life, nodded slowly. "I just want a chance to know him, to be a father to him. And you'll have that chance. But you need to be patient, respect his pace, and most importantly, respect the family he already has." Something in Ashley's firmness finally seemed to reach Matthew. That day, the visit was more relaxed, with him following Ethan's lead on what to play and how to interact, without forcing an intimacy that didn't yet exist. As Matthew was leaving that evening, Ethan surprised everyone by asking, "Are you coming back next Saturday?" A smile brightened the young man's face. "If you want me to, yes, I'll be back." "Okay, we can play that card game again. And next time you can meet Uncle Robert. He was Brave's owner before, you know." The simplicity with which Ethan accepted the complexities of his family situation left the adults in awe. To a child, it seemed perfectly reasonable to have a constellation of people in his life: mother, grandmother, father, the dog's former owner, all united by their love for him. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Ashley found Margaret on the porch, gazing at the stars. "I think it's going to work out," the young woman said, sitting beside the woman who had become so much more than just a host in her life. "With Matthew, I mean." Margaret smiled. "I think so too. He seems to be understanding his place in all this. You know what's funny?" Ashley continued. "When I think about everything that's happened, from that awful night when it was still hard to say, abandoned Ethan until now, it's like there's some bigger purpose, like it all had to happen exactly this way for us to get here. Life has a way of doing that, Margaret agreed. We don't always understand the plan while we're living it. Brave, who had followed them to the porch, lay down at their feet, his usual spot. Margaret, watching the dog, thought about how a simple stray had changed so many lives, creating connections no one could have foreseen. The stray dog that had barked insistently at a trash can had done much more than save a baby that day. It had created a family where before there were only lonely, fragmented people, and now that family continued to grow and adapt, welcoming new people without losing its essence. "We're blessed, aren't we?" murmured Margaret, placing her hand over Ashley's. "We are," the young woman agreed, "very blessed." As time passed, Matthew's presence in Ethan's life became something natural. What had started as hesitant, uncomfortable visits evolved into a genuine father-son relationship. Matthew proved willing to follow the terms set by Ashley and Margaret, respecting Ethan's routine and the central role the two women played in his life. Ethan was now 6 years old and about to start first grade. He was a sociable, intelligent child, surprisingly mature for his age. Qualities Margaret attributed to the unique circumstances of his upbringing, surrounded by adults who loved him deeply. Brave, now estimated by the veterinarian to be nearly 9 years old, was beginning to show signs of aging. His movements were a little slower, he slept more than before, and white hairs dominated his muzzle. But his loyalty and devotion to Ethan remained unwavering. Ashley was in her final year of college, about to graduate as a social worker. She had already started an internship at the very same Child Protective Services where her case had been handled years before, bringing her journey full circle. On a sunny Sunday morning, the expanded family gathered for a picnic in the park. Margaret, Ashley, Ethan, Matthew, who was now dating a co-worker who occasionally joined them, Robert and his daughter Sophie, now a teenager, and even Ashley's parents who were visiting. As the children played under the watchful eyes of the adults, Margaret observed the scene with a sense of fulfillment she had never imagined feeling in her years of lonely widowhood. Her life, which had once seemed over, now overflowed with connections, purpose, and love. Brave lay in the shade of a nearby tree, maintaining his usual watchful post. Margaret noticed that, though he kept his eyes on Ethan, the dog seemed more relaxed today, as if he knew there were many guardians present. Robert approached and sat beside her on the bench. "He's getting old," he remarked, following Margaret's gaze toward Brave. "We all are," she replied with a serene smile. "But look at what he's accomplished in his life. Saved a child, brought a family together, reunited with his first owner. Not many humans can boast as much," Robert agreed. "You know, I never properly thanked you for letting me stay a part of his life. And I never thanked you for not taking him away when you found him. You could have, it was your right," Robert smiled. "Rights aren't everything in life. Sometimes you have to look beyond them to see what really matters." The comment made Margaret reflect on how things had evolved with Matthew. The young man, who had initially insisted on his rights as the biological father, gradually understood that his role in Ethan's life would be richer and more meaningful if he worked with the family that already existed, rather than trying to compete with it. Ethan and Sophie came running over, followed by Brave at a slower trot. "Grandma Margaret, Dad," Ethan called excitedly. "We're going to show everyone the new trick we taught Brave." The adults gathered in a semicircle. Ethan stood in the higher center and raised his hand in a commanding gesture. "Brave friends, one," he ordered in a clear voice. To everyone's surprise, the dog began moving in circles, approaching each person present and offering his paw or nuzzling their hand as if greeting each one. "Amazing," murmured Matthew, clearly impressed. "How did you teach him that?" "It was Ethan's idea," explained Ashley proudly. "He said Brave needed to recognize that we're all family now, even if we live in different homes." The simplicity and depth of Ethan's thought left the adults momentarily speechless. That was precisely what they had become. An unusual family, united by extraordinary circumstances, and love for a child who had almost not been given a chance to live. As the sun began to set, they packed up the picnic and said their goodbyes. On the way home, Ethan fell asleep in the back seat of the car, his head resting against Brave's body, who kept faithful watch despite being visibly tired from the long day. "He's aging quickly," Ashley whispered, careful not to wake her son. "The vet said street dogs who've endured hardships tend to have shorter lifespans." Margaret felt a tightness in her chest. The thought of losing Brave was too painful to consider. "He still has many years ahead," she replied, more to comfort herself than from conviction, "and he's getting the best care possible." Time, as always, passed relentlessly. Ethan turned 8, growing strong and healthy, with no further complications from the heart condition that had nearly taken him as a baby. He was in 3rd grade and loved science, influenced by both Matthew and Robert, who often helped him with school projects. Ashley, now graduated and working as a social worker at the same child protective services that had once judged her, had become a fierce advocate for programs supporting teen mothers. Her own story served as powerful testimony in the talks she gave at schools. Margaret, at 79, still had a sharp mind and a youthful heart, though her body showed the inevitable signs of age. The pain in her knees had worsened, and she now used a cane for longer walks. But her energy for keeping up with family life remained unwavering. Brave, however, had aged significantly in the last 2 years. Now around 11, the dog who had once barked tirelessly to save a baby moved slowly with arthritis in his hind legs. He still followed Ethan everywhere, but needed frequent breaks to rest. One autumn afternoon, Margaret noticed something different about Brave. The old dog lay in his favorite spot by the window, but didn't lift his head when she entered the room, something he always did. "Brave?" she called softly, moving closer. The dog slowly opened his eyes and tried to stand, but his legs didn't seem to respond well. Margaret sat on the floor beside him, ignoring the protest of her own knees, and stroked his head. "It's all right, old friend," she murmured. "You can rest." When Ashley arrived from work with Ethan from school, she found them still like that. She immediately sensed something was wrong. "Grandma, what's wrong with Brave?" Ethan ran to the dog, kneeling beside him. "Is Brave sick?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I think he's just very tired today, sweetheart," Margaret replied, exchanging a meaningful glance with Ashley. "Why don't you get him some fresh water?" As Ethan went to the kitchen, Ashley whispered, "We need to take him to the vet." Dr. Miller, who had cared for Brave for years, did a full exam and confirmed their fears. His advanced age, combined with the wear of years living on the streets before finding a home, was finally taking its toll. The dog's heart was failing. "He may live a few more weeks, perhaps months, with medication," the veterinarian explained gently, "but it will be important to monitor his quality of life and not let him suffer." The news was met with silent tears. For Ethan, they explained, in simpler terms, that Brave was very old and would need special care. "Like how we took care of him when he was sick?" the boy asked, referring to an episode the previous year when Brave had an infection. "Yes, sweetheart, but this time is different. Brave has lived many years and now his body is tired." Ethan thought for a moment, his small face taking on the serious expression that so reminded them of Ashley. "So we have to make him happy every day, right?" "Exactly," agreed Margaret, amazed by the child's wisdom. In the days that followed, Ethan's entire extended family sprang into action. Matthew spent more time at the apartment, helping carry Brave to the park when his paws hurt too much to walk. Robert and Sophie brought special treats and soft toys. The neighbors, who over the years had become almost like extended family, visited regularly to see the neighborhood hero, as many affectionately called the old dog. Brave accepted it all with the serene dignity that had always defined him. Even weakened, he kept his watchful eyes on Ethan, as if wanting to reassure himself that his mission was still fulfilled. One evening, as everyone was having dinner, Ethan made an announcement. "I want to throw a birthday party for Brave." "But honey, we don't know exactly when his birthday is," Ashley explained. "We can celebrate the day he found us, or better, the day we found him," Ethan insisted. "My teacher said celebrations are for remembering important things, and that was the most important day of all." It was impossible to argue with such logic. So on the exact day marking 7 years since his rescue from the trash can, they held a small celebration. the apartment filled with people who had been touched by the extraordinary story of that family. They had prepared an especially comfortable bed for Brave in the living room, where he could watch everything, tired but visibly pleased by the attention. Brenda, the social worker who was now Ashley's colleague, brought a scrapbook she had put together over the years, documenting the journey from abandonment to the unconventional family they had become. There were photos, news clippings, letters from people inspired by the story, even drawings from children who had heard about the heroic dog at school. "You've built something extraordinary here," she said, handing the album to Margaret. "Something far beyond what any of us could have imagined that night at the police station." The party lasted until dusk, with Ethan staying by Brave's side most of the time, telling the dog stories as if wanting to ensure he wouldn't forget any of the moments they had shared. As the guests began to leave, Robert approached Margaret. "You know, Buddy was just an ordinary dog when he lived with me," he remarked. "It was with you all that he became special, that he found his purpose." "I think we all did," Margaret replied, looking around the room full of people brought together by fate and a stray dog. 3 days after the party, on a quiet Sunday morning, Brave closed his eyes for the last time, lying in his bed with Ethan asleep beside him, having kept watch over his friend through the night. He passed as he had lived, quietly dignified, a protector to the end. The grief was deep, especially for Ethan, who had never known life without his furry guardian, but there was also acceptance, an early understanding that Brave had fulfilled his extraordinary mission. At the small funeral, held in the garden of Robert's home, which offered a shady spot under a maple tree, each person present shared a memory. Ethan, surprising everyone, wanted to speak first. "Brave saved my life when I was a baby," he said with touching seriousness, "and then he taught me to be courageous and to protect those I love. Now he'll rest, but I'll always remember what he taught me." Margaret, watching the grandson life had given her so late, saw in him the same determination, intelligence, and loyalty she had seen in Brave the day she found him barking at the trash can. Somehow the spirit of the heroic dog lived on in the boy he had saved. 5 years passed. Ethan, now 13, was a thoughtful and compassionate teenager, passionate about biology, and determined to become a veterinarian. In his room, alongside the typical books and posters of his age, there was a special spot on the shelf for a framed photo of a brown-haired mutt. Ashley, at 32, had become the coordinator of an innovative program for vulnerable teen mothers. Her work had gained national recognition, and she often traveled to give talks about her methods. She had found a partner, Carl, a math teacher who adored Ethan as if he were his own son. Matthew remained present in Ethan's life, now married, with a young daughter whom the boy loved like a sister. The family had grown in ways no one could have predicted, and Margaret, at 84, watched it all with the serenity of someone who knew she had been part of something truly extraordinary. Her movements were slower now, and Ethan often joked that he was the one taking care of her, not the other way around. But her mind remained as sharp as ever, especially when she told the story of the dog and the trash can to the neighborhood children. One special afternoon, everyone gathered for a ceremony in the city park. After years of community campaigning, led mostly by Ethan, City Hall had agreed to install a small bronze statue, a mutt with its snout raised as if alerting the world. The plaque read simply, "Brave, because sometimes heroes have 4 paws." As she watched Ethan cut the ribbon, surrounded by Ashley, Matthew, Robert, and so many others who had become part of that family constellation, Margaret felt a deep peace. She remembered that rainy afternoon so many years ago when a persistent dog had pulled her from her isolation to show that even in the most unlikely places, life still fights to exist. Like that abandoned baby, she too had been given a second chance. And as the sun set over the park, casting a golden glow on the bronze statue, Margaret smiled, knowing that some stories never truly end. They simply transform, grow, and inspire new ones to emerge. End of story. Dear listener, it was the love of a simple mutt that changed so many lives. And you, have you made a difference in someone's life today? Share your thoughts on our story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming tales.